The conference room smelled like burnt ambition and someone's forgotten lunch. I had been in this building for 6 years. 6 years of arriving before the security guard changed shifts, of knowing which elevator had the broken button on floor 7, of memorizing the names of every cleaning crew member because they were the only people who ever said good morning to me without wanting something in return. And now I was sitting across from 2 men in suits who had never once asked my last name. "We appreciate everything you bring to the team, Nadia," said Anthony Holt, my department head, folding his hands like he was about to say grace at a dinner he hadn't cooked. "But the VP of infrastructure role requires a certain leadership profile." "A leadership profile," I repeated. "Visibility, executive presence, you know how these things work." I knew exactly how these things worked. I had been making them work for 6 years. The other man, Gregory Fitch, Chief Operating Officer, a title he wore like a crown he'd inherited rather than earned, nodded with the solemn gravity of someone who had never rebooted a server in his life. "The board wants someone who can walk into a room and command it." "The board," I said, "would like to know who fixed the outage during the Prescott acquisition last March at 2 in the morning." Neither of them answered. Because neither of them knew. I stood, thanked them for their time in the precise, bloodless tone I had perfected over a decade in corporate infrastructure, and walked out of the room with the promotion I had built an entire company's backbone to earn, still sitting on the table behind me like something neither of them had bothered to pick up. My name is Nadia Osei-Mensah, and for 6 years I was the reason Vantage systems didn't fall apart. Not in the dramatic, movie trailer sense. In the real sense, the unsexy, under-photographed, deeply unglamorous sense of the word, reason. I was the reason the client portal stayed online. I was the reason the disaster recovery plan was actually a plan and not a PowerPoint with clip art of fire extinguishers. I was the reason 17 different departments could do their jobs without knowing why their jobs worked. I grew up in a family of engineers. My mother designed water filtration systems for rural communities. My father spent 30 years as a telecommunications technician, climbing towers in weather that would ground airplanes. They taught me that the most important work is usually the least visible, that the structure holding everything up is, by design, the thing nobody sees. I carried that lesson into every job I'd ever had, right up until the moment I realized it had become my cage. When I joined Vantage Systems, the infrastructure was held together with the corporate equivalent of baling wire and wishful thinking. My predecessor had left mid-quarter under circumstances nobody would explain clearly, and the chaos he left behind was the kind that makes senior engineers cry in parking lots. I spent 4 months rebuilding from the foundation. I created the documentation library, 700 pages of process guides, organized by system, cross-referenced by department, color-coded by urgency level. I built the incident response playbook. I designed the redundancy architecture that would later be cited in an industry white paper that Anthony Holt presented at a conference with his name on the byline. I was not bitter about that, not exactly. I was precise about it. There is a difference. Over 6 years, I had become so embedded in the company's functioning that I was essentially invisible in the way that load-bearing walls are invisible. You don't see them, but remove them, and the ceiling introduces itself to the floor. My annual reviews were glowing. Indispensable. Extraordinary technical depth. The team relies on Nadia enormously. And every year, my raise came in just modest enough that I understood exactly what they thought I was worth. I had applied for the VP of infrastructure position because I had built the infrastructure. Because every senior leader in the company had at some point in the past year called me personally, bypassing their own direct reports, to ask me to fix something. Because the search committee's job requirements read like a description of what I already did every day. And I had been told, by men who couldn't locate the server room without a map I had personally created, that I lacked leadership presence. I sat in my car for 17 minutes after the meeting. I'm not prone to dramatic gestures. I don't cry easily or often, and I wasn't crying then. I was doing what I always do when something needs to be solved. I was thinking. The person they'd promoted instead of me was a man named Derek Calloway, who had been at the company for 14 months and whose primary qualification appeared to be that he spoke with great confidence in meetings. I had nothing against Derek personally. I had, in fact, trained Derek on 3 separate occasions. I had written the runbooks Derek would now be responsible for understanding. I thought about what my mother used to say when a system failed. The problem is almost never where the noise is. Find the dependency. Fix the dependency. The noise stops itself. I had been managing dependencies for 6 years without anyone understanding what that meant. It was time for them to understand. I made one decision before I started my car. I was going to keep doing my job. I was going to do my job exactly as it was written in my contract, in my job description, in the letter they had originally hired me with. Not an inch more, not a minute over, not one task outside my defined scope. I wasn't going to sabotage anything. I wasn't going to be petty or cruel or theatrical. I was simply going to stop being invisible. The first morning was a Tuesday. I arrived at 8:55, my contracted start time, rather than 6:45, the time I had been arriving for so long that the security guard Martinez had started saving me a coffee from the break room that opened at 7. When I walked past him at 8:55, he looked at me with a faintly alarmed expression, the way you look at someone whose routine has broken without explanation. "Everything okay, Ms. Osei-Mensah?" "Everything's fine, Martinez. Thank you." I went to my desk, opened my ticketing system, and began working through the 17 items formally assigned to me. My email contained, as it always did, approximately 4 times that many requests, forwarded issues, CC'd emergencies, informal asks wrapped in "hey, quick question," phrasing that had always been my cue to drop everything and perform miracles. I read them, I triaged mentally. I addressed the 2 that fell within my formal scope. I let the rest sit. By 10:30, I had received 4 Slack messages, 2 emails marked urgent, and a desk visit from a developer named Priya who looked like she hadn't slept. "Nadia, the data sync for the Holloway client demo is broken. They present in 2 hours and the dashboard is pulling stale numbers. I've been trying to reach you since." "That's a data pipeline issue," I said pleasantly. "That sits with the data engineering team, Anthony's group." She blinked. "But you always." "I know, but my scope is core infrastructure. Data pipeline troubleshooting belongs with data engineering." I turned back to my screen. I'd contact Ruben. He should be able to help. Ruben, we both knew, had never successfully diagnosed a pipeline issue without calling me first. I did not say this. I smiled warmly and returned to my work. Priya stood there for 3 more seconds, then left with the stunned look of someone whose GPS has just announced it doesn't recognize the road. At noon, I ate my lunch at my desk, which I usually did anyway, except that today I was reading a novel instead of reviewing system logs from the weekend. At 3:00, Derek Calloway, my department's new VP, a title that had been mine in everything but name for 3 years, stopped by with his own look of barely managed panic. "Hey, Nadia, so there's a situation with the Westbrook account. Their VPN access has been flaky all morning, and they're complaining to Gregory directly. I wanted to loop you in." I looked at him calmly. Derek was not a bad person. He was simply a person who had been handed a map of a terrain he didn't understand, drawn by someone he had just watched not get the job of cartographer. VPN troubleshooting for enterprise accounts. That's in the Infrastructure Management Playbook, Section 4. I can pull up the document if you'd like. "I've looked at it. I don't quite follow the..." He stopped himself. "Can you just take a look? It would take you 15 minutes. I have a scheduled maintenance window at 4 that I'm prepping for. That's going to take the rest of my afternoon." "Is the maintenance urgent?" "It's scheduled," I smiled. "In the maintenance calendar approved last month." He left. He came back 12 minutes later. He left again. At 5:00, I shut down my workstation, packed my bag, and walked out of the building. My phone began vibrating before I reached my car. I had a standing Tuesday dinner with my friend Constance, who had left corporate life 4 years ago to open a ceramics studio, and whom I envied with a tenderness that had never quite tipped into regret. "Tell me everything," she said, pouring me tea from a pot she had thrown herself, a beautiful asymmetrical thing the color of river clay. I told her everything. She listened with the focused attention of someone who understood craft and patience, and what happens when the person doing the real work goes unacknowledged for too long. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You know what you're doing is essentially pulling the load-bearing column out by 1 inch at a time," she said. "I'm not pulling anything. I'm just standing where the column actually is. Same result eventually. That's their problem to solve, not mine." She smiled into her tea. "How long do you give it?" 3 days before the Westbrook thing escalates. A week before something larger breaks. 2 weeks maximum before someone with actual authority knocks on my desk and wants to have a real conversation. Constance raised her cup. "To structural integrity. And to the people who maintain it." It was 10 days. I had underestimated how long the existing momentum of my systems would carry them before anyone realized what was actually holding everything up. The documentation I'd created was thorough. Some people could follow it. Most could follow it for small things. For the large things, the interconnected things, the things where you needed to understand not just what to do but why it worked, and what would happen if you did it slightly differently. For those, the documentation was a map, and they were lost without the cartographer. The breaking point was the Meridian migration. Meridian Financial was Vantage Systems' largest enterprise client, 2 years in the making, a contract worth more than everything else on the books combined. The migration of their legacy systems to our platform had been my project from the architecture stage. I had designed the process. I had written the runbook. I had built the rollback procedures. I had scheduled the migration window for a Saturday in October, chosen specifically because Meridian's transaction volume dropped by 60% on autumn weekends due to their customer base's demographics, which I had studied for 11 months. Derek inherited the project on a Thursday. By the following Friday, he had rescheduled the migration to accommodate a conflict with a golf event. He moved it to a Wednesday. He did not tell me. I found out when the Meridian project coordinator emailed me to confirm the new timeline, and I sat at my desk for a long moment feeling something cold settle through my chest. Wednesday was not a low-volume day for Meridian Financial. Wednesday was, in fact, their peak settlement day. Any significant interruption to their systems on a Wednesday would trigger regulatory reporting requirements, potential SLA penalties, and the kind of reputational damage that ends vendor relationships permanently. I wrote a careful, thorough, professionally worded email to Derek explaining this. I copied Anthony. I flagged it urgent. I documented it in the project management system. Derek responded, "Thanks for the heads up. I've already run it by Gregory and he's comfortable with the change. Looking forward to a smooth migration." I read that email twice. Then I documented my objection formally in the project record, added a timestamp, and returned to my scheduled work. The migration began at 11:00 p.m. on Wednesday. I was at home, in bed, reading. At 11:47 p.m., my phone lit up with 7 messages in 4 minutes. I read them. I set the phone face down on my nightstand. I turned out the light. At 12:15 a.m., my phone rang. It was Anthony. "Nadia, we have a situation." "I know. I documented my concerns on the 14th. They're in the project record." A pause. "The migration is failing. We're 40 minutes in and 3 critical modules won't transfer. Meridian's CTO is on a bridge call. The rollback procedure is in Section 9 of the runbook. Subsection C covers partial transfer failures." "Derek can't find. We're not able to," he stopped. I could hear the fluorescent buzz of an office at midnight in the background, the particular silence of a building that should be empty but isn't. "We need you on this call." "I'll need to review my contract regarding after-hours emergency support," I said. not meanly, not coldly, factually. I believe it specifies an on-call rotation, which I was removed from in July when Derek took over the Meridian project. Nadia, I'll look into it and call you back. I hung up. I retrieved my contract from my email archive. I read the relevant clause. I called Anthony back in 11 minutes. My contract specifies a 4-hour response window for after-hours escalations outside my designated on-call rotation, with overtime compensation at 1.5x my hourly rate. If Vantage would like to engage that clause, I'll need written confirmation from HR before I join any calls. There was a long silence. I'll have HR send you an email right now. I'll look for it. I was on the bridge call by 12:45 a.m. It took me 40 minutes to stabilize the migration and implement the partial rollback that protected Meridian's Wednesday settlement processing. I guided the team through it step by step, quietly, precisely, doing the work I had always done, except that this time every word I said was being heard by Meridian's CTO, by Gregory Fitch, by 4 members of the executive team who had clearly been dragged out of their homes, and by Derek Calloway, who said nothing for the entire 40 minutes. When it was over, Meridian's CTO said, "Thank God Nadia was available." No one responded to that. The meeting was Thursday morning at 9. Not my usual Thursday morning check-in. A different kind of meeting, Gregory Fitch's office, which I had been in exactly once before, the day I was hired. His assistant had sent the calendar invite at 6:00 a.m. with no subject line. Anthony was there when I arrived. Derek was not. Gregory stood when I entered, which was the first time I could recall him standing for anything that wasn't a client or a board member. "Nadia, sit down, please." I sat. "I'll be direct," he said, which powerful men always say right before they are not direct. "Last night exposed some significant gaps in how we've structured the leadership of your department. I want to address them." "I appreciate that." "Derek will be moving to a strategic advisory role." He said this carefully, like it was fragile. "We're restructuring the department. The VP of Infrastructure position is open again, and I'd like you to take it." I looked at him. I looked at Anthony, who was studying his hands. "The Meridian CTO called me this morning," Gregory continued, "specifically to talk about you. He used the phrase, 'the only person in your organization who understands what she's doing.'" He cleared his throat. "That was uncomfortable for me to hear." I imagine it was. I should have been in that meeting in the spring. The promotion decision should have come to me. I waited. "Can I ask you something honestly, Gregory?" He nodded. If last night hadn't happened, if the migration had gone smoothly, if Meridian's CTO hadn't called, would we be having this conversation? The silence was its own answer. "I don't know," he said finally, and I respected him slightly more for saying it. "Then I'd like to tell you what I need," I said, "and I want it in writing before I accept anything." I had drafted the document 2 days earlier, because I am the kind of person who anticipates systems and plans for their outputs. It was 4 pages. It outlined a compensation structure that accurately reflected my contribution to the company's revenue and stability. It described the scope of authority the VP role would require to function, actual authority, not the performance of authority while someone else made the decisions. It included a requirement for a formal knowledge transfer protocol for any role change, so that no single person's departure could destabilize the organization the way mine eventually would. And it included a proposal for an internal talent audit, a structured review of every employee at Vantage Systems to identify people who were carrying disproportionate invisible weight. That last item was the one Gregory read twice. "You want to find other people like you," he said. "I want to make sure the company isn't dependent on people being invisible in order to be stable. That's a structural vulnerability. It's also," I said carefully, "not ethical." Anthony looked up then. "People don't stay invisible because they're not capable," I continued. "They stay invisible because the system rewards the performance of work over the actual doing of it. That's a design flaw, and I'd like to fix it. Gregory set the document down. How long have you been thinking about this? Approximately 3 years. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. And you never brought it to me. I brought elements of it to Anthony on 4 separate occasions. I have the email records. Anthony did not look up this time. All right, Gregory said. We'll negotiate the details, but yes, in principle, yes. He extended his hand. I'm sorry it took a crisis for me to see what was in front of me. I shook his hand. It usually does, I said. That's why we build redundancy. I called my mother that evening. She was in the garden. I could tell from the sounds in the background, the light percussion of a trowel against packed earth, the way her voice carried in open air. Tell me, she said, because she always knows when there's something to tell. I told her about the 6 years, the promotion, the midnight migration, the meeting with Gregory. I told her about the document I'd drafted, the talent audit proposal, the things I wanted to change. She was quiet for a while after I finished. You know what your grandfather used to say about bridges? She asked. Tell me. He said the most honest thing about a bridge is that you never think about it when it's doing its job. You only think about it when something's wrong. He said a good engineer's goal is to build something so well that it becomes part of the landscape. Invisible. That sounds like the problem, I said. That was his joke, she said. The second part, he'd say, and that's why an engineer should never be their own bridge. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. The first 90 days in the new role were the most exhausting and the most clarifying of my professional life. I inherited a department that functioned the way a house functions when one person has been quietly fixing everything, while the others assumed the house was simply lucky. Pipes that had been duct-taped rather than replaced. Processes that worked only because one person had memorized the workaround. Institutional knowledge living entirely in the heads of people who had no idea it wasn't documented anywhere. My first act was to freeze all non-emergency project changes for 2 weeks while I conducted a full systems audit. People were not happy about this. I explained, in the measured and unapologetic tone of someone who has fixed too many emergencies caused by changes made without understanding, that we were trading 2 weeks of frustration for a reduction in midnight crisis calls. The executive team backed me. Barely. Enough. The talent audit was harder. I had expected to find a handful of people doing disproportionate work. I found 19. 19 people across 7 departments who were the quiet connective tissue of their teams, who were rated meets expectations, in performance reviews that didn't have categories for what they actually did, who had never been promoted not because they weren't qualified, but because their managers couldn't afford to lose them. I brought the findings to Gregory in a meeting I had prepared for with the same rigor I prepared for major migrations. 19, he said, looking at the summary page. At minimum, these are the ones I could identify in 60 days with the access I had. I think the actual number is higher. What do you propose? A revised performance framework, one that includes contribution to organizational resilience as a formal evaluation category. Promotion pathways that don't require people to make themselves visible in specific ways that favor certain communication styles over certain competencies. I paused. And a commitment that, when we identify someone doing VP-level work, we have the conversation before they've been doing it for 3 years. Gregory looked at me over the report for a moment. Is this about you? It's about the 19, I said. I'm fine. 6 months later, 3 of the 19 had been promoted into roles that matched what they had actually been doing. 2 more were in the process. The infrastructure team's incident response time had dropped by 34%. The Meridian account had expanded. The documentation library was now a company-wide system with required contribution protocols, meaning that knowledge lived in the organization rather than in individual people. Derek Calloway had left for a role at another company. I had wished him genuinely well and meant it. He wasn't the problem. He was a symptom of the problem, and the problem was being addressed. Anthony and I had reached a professional equilibrium that was honest if not warm. He had acknowledged, in a one-on-one meeting that I suspect cost him something, that he had underestimated me, and that his reasoning for the promotion decision had been more about his own comfort than my qualifications. It wasn't a full reckoning, but it was real, and I respected real things. On a Thursday in March, 6 months and 3 weeks after a meeting in a conference room that smelled like burnt ambition, I was in my office when my assistant knocked. The Kellerman Group is on the line. They're asking for you by name, something about their infrastructure assessment. The Kellerman Group was a firm 3 times the size of Vantage Systems. Put them through, I said. There's a thing that happens when you stop making yourself small enough to fit in the space someone else has decided you belong in. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, the way load-bearing structures work, underneath the visible thing, in the part no one sees, in the place where the real weight is held. I didn't blow anything up. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't make speeches or stage confrontations or wait for the perfect cinematic moment to make my point. I simply stopped hiding the scope of my competence in order to make other people comfortable with what they had decided I was. That is simultaneously the simplest and hardest thing I have ever done. If you work in infrastructure, literal or organizational, you know the particular loneliness of building things that work so well they render themselves invisible. You know what it's like to be the person everyone calls when it breaks, and no one notices when it doesn't. You know the specific flavor of being told you're not ready for a room you've been furnishing for years. I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me 6 years ago, in the particular clarity of someone who has now been on both sides of this. The skills that make you indispensable are not different from the skills that qualify you to lead. They are the same skills. The ability to understand systems, to anticipate failures, to build things that outlast your involvement, to see the whole while managing the parts, that is exactly what leadership requires. What leadership additionally requires is that you stop allowing others to position your competence as a service they consume rather than a capability they should develop alongside you. Your worth is not defined by other people's willingness to see it, but you do have a responsibility to yourself and to the 19 people like you in every organization you'll ever work in to stop making it easy for them not to look. The bridge doesn't need to announce itself, but the engineer should.